Little girl gives last loaf to bankrupt millionaire. Years later he finds her. Thunder cracked across the Chicago skyline as rain pelted the windows of Thompson Construction's latest skyscraper project. On the 42nd floor, John Miller wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting through the downpour at the loose scaffolding swaying dangerously in the wind. His supervisor had ordered the crew to continue working despite the storm, threatening to fire anyone who refused. "This isn't safe," John muttered, reaching for his phone to document the hazardous conditions. Behind him, footsteps approached quickly. A hand grabbed his shoulder roughly. "You trying to cause trouble again?" Miller, the supervisor's voice was cold. "Remember, you've got a family to feed. Would be a shame if something happened to your position here." John thought of his wife Mary's tired smile as she worked double shifts at the diner, and 7-year-old Sarah's hopeful eyes when she talked about going to college someday. With trembling hands, he pocketed his phone and turned back to the scaffolding. The metal groaned ominously in the howling wind. John took one careful step forward, then another. Lightning illuminated the city below, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rain-streaked windows, a man trapped between conscience and survival. The scaffolding shifted suddenly. John reached for the safety line, but his rain-slicked fingers found nothing. The supervisor's horrified face was the last thing he saw as the structure gave way. Hours later, Sarah stood at her bedroom window, waiting for her daddy to come home. Instead, 2 police officers appeared at their door. Through the thin walls, she heard her mother's anguished scream, a sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. On the other side of the city, in his luxurious office, CEO Richard Thompson signed papers without reading them, unaware that his signature was authorizing a cover-up that would change multiple lives forever. "I strive to create meaningful content that resonates with you. I work hard to craft stories that touch hearts and spark emotions. If you value these stories and want to be part of our storytelling journey, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing impactful narratives that make a difference." The Millers lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on Chicago's South Side, where the sound of passing trains provided a constant rhythm to their daily lives. John Miller had always been a man of principle, working his way up from apprentice to senior construction worker through 15 years of dedicated service. Every morning he would kiss his wife Mary and daughter Sarah goodbye, his calloused hands gentle as he straightened 7-year-old Sarah's school uniform collar. Mary worked as a waitress at Joey's Diner, a local establishment where regulars knew her by name and valued her warm smile and attentive service. Despite the long hours on her feet, she never complained, knowing that every extra shift brought them closer to their dream of sending Sarah to college. The family had started a small college fund, adding whatever they could spare each month, even if it meant just a few dollars. Sarah was their pride and joy, a bright-eyed child who inherited her father's strong sense of justice and her mother's compassionate heart. She excelled in school, particularly in science and mathematics, often bringing home papers marked with gold stars and encouraging notes from teachers. Her dream was to become a doctor, inspired by the kind physician who had treated her asthma when she was younger. The Millers weren't rich by any measure, but their home was filled with love and hope. Family dinners were sacred, a time when they shared their daily experiences and dreams for the future. John would often speak about his hopes for Sarah, his voice full of pride as he described how his daughter would be the first Miller to graduate from college. Mary would add her own dreams, talking about opening a small cafe someday where she could be her own boss. Their apartment walls were decorated with Sarah's artwork and academic achievements, alongside family photos from their rare but cherished vacations to nearby Lake Michigan. They had created their own version of the American dream, not one of excessive wealth or luxury, but of dignity, education, and the promise of a better tomorrow for their child. John's position at Thompson Construction Company was their backbone, providing steady income and health insurance. He had recently been promoted to team leader, a position that came with added responsibility but also the promise of a better future. The extra income had allowed them to start looking at houses in slightly better neighborhoods, dreaming of a small backyard where Sarah could play safely. Every Sunday, the family would drive around different neighborhoods, looking at houses for sale, imagining their future. Sarah would point out trees perfect for climbing, while Mary would evaluate kitchen windows and garden spaces. John would quietly calculate mortgage payments in his head, determined to give his family the home they deserved. Their life wasn't perfect. They worried about bills like any working-class family, but they faced challenges together, with unwavering faith in each other and their shared dreams. They were the embodiment of hard work and family values, living proof that love and determination could build a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. Little did they know that their carefully constructed world was about to be shattered by corporate greed and betrayal, their modest dreams crushed under the weight of injustice that would transform their lives forever. The promotion that had seemed like a blessing would prove to be the catalyst for a tragedy that would tear their family apart, leaving behind a void that no amount of justice could fully fill. Richard Thompson's corner office on the 50th floor of Thompson Tower offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, a daily reminder of his meteoric rise to success. At 45, he had transformed his father's modest construction company into a billion-dollar empire. The wall behind his desk displayed his numerous achievements: Entrepreneur of the Year, Chicago's most influential under 50, and Business Leadership Excellence Award. Born into an upper-middle-class family, Richard had learned the construction business from the ground up. His father, James Thompson, had insisted that he spend summers working on construction sites, learning every aspect of the trade. Those experiences had shaped his early career, giving him insights that most executives lacked. However, as the company grew, Richard found himself increasingly disconnected from the day-to-day operations, trusting his management team to maintain the standards his father had established. His personal life seemed equally successful on the surface. His wife, Elizabeth, was a former corporate lawyer who now chaired several charitable foundations. Their daughter, Emma, attended an exclusive private school and showed promise as a competitive swimmer. They lived in a mansion in the prestigious North Shore area, hosted charity galas, and vacationed in exotic locations. The Thompson family appeared in society pages and business magazines, portrayed as the perfect example of American success. Yet beneath the polished exterior, cracks were beginning to show. Richard's dedication to growing the company meant missed dance recitals and family dinners. Elizabeth's hints about his absence grew increasingly bitter, and Emma had started acting out at school. The distance between them widened with each passing year, filled with expensive gifts that served as apologizes for his absence. Richard's closest relationship was with his elderly father, who still visited the office occasionally, though he had officially retired years ago. James Thompson would sit in his son's office, asking pointed questions about worker safety and family benefits, concerns that Richard increasingly delegated to his management team. The old man's disappointed sighs haunted Richard more than he cared to admit. The pressure to maintain the company's growth had led Richard to rely heavily on his executive team, particularly his CFO, Michael Sterling, and operations director, Robert Wells. They handled the details while Richard focused on strategy and public relations. He trusted them implicitly, signing documents they placed before him, attending meetings they arranged, and delivering speeches they prepared. His life had become a carefully choreographed performance, moving from one corporate achievement to another. The young man who had once known every foreman by name now barely recognized the workers in his own building. His father's principles of personal oversight and worker safety had been buried under quarterly reports and profit margins. Each morning, as his driver navigated through Chicago traffic, Richard would stare at the construction sites bearing his company's name, feeling an increasing disconnect from the empire he had built. He had everything he had ever wanted: wealth, power, influence, yet something felt fundamentally wrong, a splinter in his mind he couldn't quite identify. What Richard didn't realize was that his trusted executives had been systematically dismantling the safety protocols and worker protections his father had put in place, replacing them with cost-cutting measures that prioritized profit over people. His signature appeared on documents he hadn't read, authorizing changes he didn't understand. The Thompson Construction Company was becoming exactly what his father had always fought against: a corporate machine that valued profits over people. The facade of success he had built was about to crumble, triggered by a single act of kindness from a little girl he had yet to meet. The empire he had sacrificed his family life to build would soon reveal its rotten foundation, forcing him to confront the true cost of his success and the meaning of his father's disappointed sighs. In the shadowy corners of Thompson Construction Company's executive floors, a sophisticated system of corruption flourished beneath the polished corporate veneer. Michael Sterling and Robert Wells had spent years crafting an intricate web of kickbacks, falsified safety reports, and diverted funds, all hidden beneath layers of legitimate-looking paperwork and shell companies. Their scheme began small, minor cost-cutting measures in safety equipment, delayed maintenance on machinery, reduced training hours for new workers. But as profits increased and Richard Thompson's attention remained focused on expansion and public relations, their operation grew bolder. They created a shadow accounting system that showed one set of numbers to OSHA inspectors and another to their private contractors. The company's safety inspection team had been systematically gutted, replaced by individuals who would sign off on anything for the right price. Former safety officers who raised concerns found themselves transferred to remote sites or forced into early retirement. The few who threatened to speak out received visits from the company's legal team, armed with non-disclosure agreements and thinly veiled threats about their pension funds. Site supervisors were carefully chosen and groomed. Those who demonstrated a willingness to push workers beyond safety limits were rewarded with bonuses and promotions. Others, like John Miller's supervisor, were kept in line with a combination of incentives and blackmail. The message was clear: meet deadlines at any cost, or face consequences. The corruption extended beyond the company walls. Building inspectors received consulting fees through third-party companies. Local politicians found generous donations flowing into their campaign funds. Even union representatives were quietly compromised, their silence bought with promises of positions on corporate advisory boards. Workers who filed complaints found themselves tangled in bureaucratic nightmares. Their paperwork would mysteriously disappear, witness statements would be altered, and medical reports would be challenged by company-paid experts. The legal department had perfected the art of delayed justice, dragging out cases until desperate families accepted minimal settlements. The system was designed to be invisible to Richard Thompson. Sterling and Wells maintained a careful buffer between their activities and the CEO, ensuring that any damaging information was filtered before reaching his desk. They knew their boss's tendency to sign documents without thorough review, a habit they exploited regularly by burying dangerous decisions in routine paperwork. The executive floor operated like a well-oiled machine, with each participant understanding their role in maintaining the facade. Administrative assistants were paid generous bonuses to route certain calls away from Thompson's office. Middle managers learned to phrase their reports in ways that highlighted profits while obscuring safety concerns. This corrupt ecosystem had claimed lives before John Miller, but those deaths had been successfully buried in legal settlements and carefully worded press releases. Each incident strengthened their system as they learned to better cover their tracks. They had even turned tragedies into opportunities, using high-profile accidents to justify increased budgets for safety improvements money that would be diverted into their scheme. What Sterling and Wells didn't realize was that their perfect system had one fatal flaw: it required everyone to remain loyal out of either greed or fear. They never considered that a simple act of kindness from a 7-year-old girl would set in motion a chain of events that would expose their entire operation. Their carefully constructed house of cards was about to face a storm they couldn't bribe, threaten, or manipulate away. Snow fell silently on Chicago's frozen streets as Sarah Miller hurried home from the corner store, clutching a small paper bag containing a single loaf of bread. Her worn boots crunched through day-old snow, each step carefully placed to avoid the treacherous ice patches. The bread had cost her mother's last $3 money, meant to last until Friday's paycheck. 6 months after her father's death, the miller's life had descended into a desperate routine of barely making ends meet. The wrongful death lawsuit against Thompson Construction had drained their meager savings, and Mary's diner wages barely covered rent and utilities. Tonight's dinner would be toast and butter, a meal that had become all too familiar. As Sarah turned the corner onto their street, she noticed a figure huddled in the doorway of an abandoned storefront. The man's expensive coat, now tattered and stained, seemed oddly out of place among the usual homeless people in their neighborhood. His grey hair was matted with snow, and his face bore the hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten in days. Something about him reminded Sarah of the photo she'd seen of her grandfather, a proud man who had died before she was born. Her mother had always taught her that kindness mattered most when it was hardest to give, and her father had shown her that helping others was what made us human. Sarah stood there, snow gathering on her shoulders, weighing her options. The bread was their only food until Friday, and her mother had been skipping meals to ensure Sarah had enough to eat. Yet the man's breathing was shallow, his lips blue from cold. Without really deciding to, Sarah found herself walking toward him. So her voice trembled slightly. "Are you hungry?" The man's eyes flickered open, revealing a startling blue that seemed to hold oceans of sadness. He didn't speak, but his gaze fixed on the paper bag in her hands. Sarah noticed his fingers were red and swollen from the cold. "This is for you," she said, placing the bag beside him. "It's not much, but it's fresh. Mom says fresh bread always makes things better." The man's hand shook as he reached for the bag, his cracked lips forming words that didn't come. Sarah unzipped her worn coat and draped it over his shoulders, the way her father used to do for her on cold mornings. "My dad used to say that everyone deserves warmth and bread," she continued, her voice catching slightly at the memory. "He's in heaven now, but I think he'd want you to have these." What Sarah couldn't know was that she was looking at Richard Thompson, the man whose company had been responsible for her father's death. The once powerful CEO had hit rock bottom after his former executives framed him for embezzlement and safety violations. His assets frozen, his reputation destroyed, and his family gone, Richard had been wandering the streets for days, too ashamed to seek help. The small act of kindness from this unknown child pierced the armor of despair he'd built around himself. For the first time since his downfall, tears began to flow down his weathered cheeks. Sarah patted his shoulder awkwardly, the way her mother did when she was upset. "Things will get better," she said with the simple conviction of a child. "They have to, right?" Before turning to leave, she pulled a slightly crumpled paper star from her pocket, a gold star from her latest math test. "This is for good luck," she said, tucking it into the bread bag. "Everyone needs a star sometimes." As Sarah disappeared into the swirling snow, Richard clutched the warm bread to his chest, the child's coat around his shoulders, and her paper star in his hand. He didn't know it yet, but this moment of compassion would become the cornerstone of both their futures, a simple act of kindness that would ultimately unravel a web of corruption and heal wounds that seemed beyond repair. The simple act of kindness from the little girl triggered something in Richard's mind. As he sat in the abandoned doorway, eating the bread with trembling hands, memories began flooding back, red flags he had ignored, warnings he had dismissed, documents he had signed without reading. It started with a flash of recognition. The girl's coat bore a patch from Lincoln Elementary, the same school he had visited last year for a PR event about the company's community outreach program. That day, he had promised the children that Thompson Construction was building a safer city for their futures. Now homeless and disgraced, those words tasted like ashes in his mouth. Through the fog of his recent despair, pieces started falling into place. He remembered his father's last visit to the office, 3 months before the scandal broke. James Thompson had stormed out of a meeting with Sterling and Wells, something about safety protocols being dismantled. Richard had smoothed things over with platitudes about modernizing operations, but his father's disappointed look haunted him now. The worker death that had occurred last year, John Miller's death, had been explained away as worker negligence. Richard had accepted the official report, signed the settlement papers, and moved on. But now, sitting in the cold with nothing but time to think, inconsistencies in that case began to surface in his mind. He recalled fragments of conversations, whispered warnings from long-time employees who had suddenly retired, urgent messages from site supervisors that his assistant had deemed not priority, closed-door meetings between Sterling and Wells that would fall silent when he entered the room. Each memory was a puzzle piece he had been too busy or too blind to examine. The company's soaring profits over the last 5 years took on a sinister new light. Cost-cutting measures that had impressed shareholders now seemed suspicious. How had they managed to reduce safety training expenses by 60% while maintaining perfect inspection scores? Why had several experienced safety officers quit suddenly with generous severance packages? Richard pulled the girl's paper star from the bread bag, its golden surface catching the streetlight. He thought about her father in heaven, and a cold realization gripped him: how many other children had lost parents to his company's negligence. How many families had been destroyed while he focused on stock prices and expansion plans? His hands began to shake, not from cold but from rage. Sterling and Wells hadn't just destroyed his life, they had corrupted his father's legacy, turned a company built on worker safety into a death trap, and used his signature to authorize it all. The evidence must still exist somewhere. They couldn't have erased everything. A new sense of purpose began to cut through his despair. He might have lost his wealth, his family, and his reputation, but he still had his mind, and now he had a mission. The girl's simple act of kindness had given him more than bread and warmth. It had given him clarity and a reason to fight back. Richard carefully folded the paper star and tucked it into his wallet, the one possession he had managed to keep. He would need help, allies who could access company records without alerting Sterling and Wells. The loyal employees who had been forced out might be willing to talk now. The safety officers who had quit, they must have kept documentation to protect themselves. Standing up, Richard felt strength returning to his legs. The path ahead would be dangerous. Sterling and Wells had already proven they would stop at nothing to protect their scheme. They had resources, connections, and the weight of the corrupted system behind them. But Richard had something they didn't expect: nothing left to lose, and a burning need to make things right. As he stepped out of the doorway, wrapping the girl's coat tighter around his shoulders, Richard made a silent vow. He would expose the truth, restore his father's legacy, and ensure that no more children would lose their parents to corporate greed. The girl who had saved his life with her kindness deserved nothing less. The snow had stopped falling, and through breaks in the clouds, stars were becoming visible. Somewhere out there, a little girl was probably going hungry tonight because she chose to help a stranger. Richard Thompson, former CEO of Thompson Construction, began walking with purpose. It was time to rebuild, not with steel and concrete this time, but with truth and justice. The plan to destroy Richard Thompson had been meticulously crafted in Sterling and Wells' private meetings over expensive whiskey and Cuban cigars. They had watched their CEO's growing distraction, his blind trust in their management, and recognized their opportunity to seize control of Thompson Construction completely. The operation began with subtle manipulations of financial records. Sterling, as CFO, created a complex trail of transactions that appeared to show Richard embezzling company funds through offshore accounts. Wells synchronized these false records with manipulated safety violation reports, building a narrative of a CEO cutting corners for personal gain. They chose their moment carefully the week after Elizabeth had taken Emma to Europe for a summer vacation. With Richard alone in their mansion, they launched their attack. An anonymous tip to the SEC triggered an investigation. Simultaneously, leaked documents reached key journalists, revealing apparent evidence of Richard's involvement in safety violations and financial fraud. The media frenzy was immediate and devastating. Headlines screamed about the fall of Chicago's business titan. Stories painted Richard as a corrupt executive who had sacrificed worker safety for personal profit. The most damaging revelation was a fabricated email chain that seemed to show Richard personally ordering the cover-up of John Miller's death. Elizabeth, already strained by years of Richard's workaholism, saw the news in Paris. Without waiting for his explanation, she filed for divorce and announced she was accepting a position at a law firm in London. Emma, influenced by her mother's certainty of Richard's guilt, refused to take his calls. The board of directors, carefully stacked with Sterling and Wells allies, called an emergency meeting. Richard walked into an ambush. Evidence of his supposed crimes was presented with damning certainty. His attempts to defend himself were met with cold stares and rehearsed outrage. By meeting's end, he was voted out of his own company. But federal investigators froze his assets pending investigation. His high-priced friends suddenly became unavailable. The country club quietly revoked his membership. His lawyer, handpicked by Sterling years ago, advised him to stay quiet and work on a plea deal. The final blow came when James Thompson, lying in his hospital bed, saw the news. The stress triggered a massive heart attack. Richard, rushing to the hospital, arrived too late to say goodbye. His father died believing his son had destroyed everything they had built together. The sophisticated nature of Sterling and Wells' fraud left Richard with no way to prove his innocence. Every document he might have used to defend himself had been altered or destroyed. Loyal employees who might have spoken up had been systematically removed over the years. Within weeks, Richard Thompson went from living in a North Shore mansion to sleeping in homeless shelters. His credit cards were cancelled, his bank accounts frozen, his reputation destroyed. Former business associates crossed the street to avoid him. Restaurants where he had been a valued regular now asked him to leave. The cruel irony was that his very success had enabled his downfall. He had built the company so large, delegated so much authority, that Sterling and Wells had been able to operate their scheme right under his nose. His trust in them, his focus on expansion and public relations, had left him vulnerable to their betrayal. Now, sitting in a frozen doorway with a child's coat around his shoulders, Richard realized that his ignorance had cost more than just his own fortune. It had cost workers their lives, families their fathers, and children their futures. The bread given to him by a little girl, probably purchased with her family's last dollars, symbolized both his deepest failure and, though he didn't know it yet, his path to redemption. Sterling and Wells celebrated their victory in the penthouse office that had once been Richard's, congratulating themselves on their perfect execution. They never imagined that their carefully constructed scheme would begin to unravel because of a simple act of kindness between a homeless man and a compassionate child. Life for Sarah Miller had become a daily battle against poverty and prejudice. At Lincoln Elementary, her worn clothes and scuffed shoes made her an easy target for bullies. The other children, many from affluent families, whispered behind her back about her free lunch status and second-hand supplies. The bright student who once raised her hand eagerly in class now sat quietly, trying to become invisible. The change in their circumstances affected every aspect of their lives. Sarah's asthma medication, once covered by her father's insurance, became a luxury they could barely afford. During attacks, she learned to breathe slowly and stay calm, knowing each trip to the emergency room meant her mother would have to work extra shifts to pay the bills. Her mother's determination to maintain Sarah's education meant sacrifices that broke the young girl's heart. She pretended not to notice when Mary skipped meals, claiming she'd eaten at the diner. She learned to ignore her own hunger pangs, drinking water to fill her empty stomach during long school days. The gold stars she still earned on tests seemed hollow now, knowing each school project meant choosing between art supplies and dinner. The worst came during career day when parents visited to talk about their jobs. Sarah sat alone while other children proudly introduced their mothers and fathers. Tommy Jenkins, whose father owned a local business, pointed at her empty chair and loudly asked, "Where's your dad, Sarah?" "Oh wait, he was the one who died because he was drunk at work, right?" The cruel words, echoing the company's official story, sent Sarah running from the classroom in tears. She found refuge in the library, where the kind librarian, Mrs. Anderson, found her hiding between the shelves. Instead of sending her back to class, Mrs. Anderson gave her a job helping to organize books during lunch period, a sanctuary from the cafeteria's social battlefield, and a chance to read stories that helped her escape reality. At home, Sarah took on responsibilities far beyond her years. She learned to cook simple meals from whatever was available, to mend clothes with careful stitches, to calculate grocery prices and stretch dollars until payday. When the electricity was cut off for late payment, she did her homework by candlelight, determined not to let their circumstances affect her grades. The neighborhood itself seemed to conspire against their dignity. Their apartment building, once merely modest, fell into disrepair as the landlord ignored maintenance requests. During winter, they huddled under blankets when the heating failed, and in summer they sweltered without air conditioning. Sarah learned to dodge the drug dealers who began appearing on their corner, and to ignore the sounds of arguments and police sirens that punctuated their nights. Yet amid these hardships, Sarah maintained a quiet strength inherited from both her parents. She began collecting discarded cans and bottles, turning them in for deposit money that she secretly slipped into her mother's purse. She offered to help elderly neighbors with errands, earning small tips that she saved in a jar labeled Mom's Birthday Fund. The girl who had once dreamed of becoming a doctor now understood medicine, from a patient's perspective, the humiliation of free clinics, the desperation of choosing between treatment and rent, the way illness becomes a luxury the poor cannot afford. These experiences didn't diminish her dream, they transformed it. She began to imagine a different kind of medical practice, one that would serve people like her mother, who worked hard but still couldn't afford basic care. Each morning, Sarah would touch the photo of her father on their wall, promising him she would make him proud. She kept his voice in her memory, his stories of standing up for what was right, his lessons about helping others, even when you had little to give. The bread she had given to the homeless man represented more than just food. It was her way of honoring her father's values, of proving that poverty might claim their comfort, but not their compassion. What Sarah couldn't know was that her small act of kindness had set in motion events that would eventually expose the truth about her father's death. The homeless man in the doorway would become the key to unlocking justice, though for now he remained just another face among the city's forgotten souls, and she remained just another child learning the harsh lessons of poverty in America. With renewed purpose after Sarah's act of kindness, Richard Thompson began methodically reconstructing the web of corruption that had destroyed his company's integrity. Living in homeless shelters, he used public libraries for research, carefully documenting patterns he had missed during his years as CEO. His first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Janet Matthews, his former secretary who had been abruptly retired with a generous package, recognized him at a soup kitchen. Instead of shunning him like others had, she slipped him a USB drive containing copies of emails she had wisely saved, correspondence that showed Sterling and Wells systematically intercepting and filtering information meant for Richard's review. Working from a corner of the public library, Richard began connecting the dots. He discovered that every safety officer who had raised concerns about violations had been systematically removed. Their replacements were all connected to a consulting firm owned by Wells' brother-in-law. The pattern was clear, but proving it would be nearly impossible without access to internal records. Through Janet's connections, Richard made contact with former employees who had been silenced. Each carried a piece of the puzzle: altered safety reports, backdated inspection certificates, falsified training records. But fear kept them from coming forward publicly. Sterling and Wells had files on everyone, and their reach extended into local government and law enforcement. Richard's investigation took a darker turn when he discovered a pattern of suspicious accidents at Thompson construction sites. John Miller's death wasn't an isolated incident, there had been others, all carefully buried under settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Each victim's family had faced the same treatment: quick payoffs coupled with threats of lengthy legal battles if they pursued further action. As he dug deeper, Richard began noticing he was being followed. Unmarked cars appeared outside the library. Mysterious figures watched him from across streets. His few remaining allies reported strange phone calls and unexpected visits from tax auditors. The message was clear: stop digging. The warning became more explicit when Janet Matthews' apartment was mysteriously burglarized. Nothing was stolen except her computer and personal files. The next day, she received an envelope containing photos of her grandchildren at their school playground. She tearfully cut off contact with Richard, leaving him more isolated than ever. Richard's lowest point came when he attempted to contact his daughter Emma. He had managed to track her to her new school in London and sent a carefully worded letter explaining everything. 2 weeks later, the letter was returned unopened, with a restraining order from Elizabeth's lawyers threatening legal action if he attempted further contact. The betrayal cut deepest when Richard discovered that his own lawyer, James Morris, had been complicit from the beginning. Morris had deliberately mishandled Richard's defense, ensuring that evidence of his innocence never reached the courts. Bank records showed massive payments to Morris's offshore accounts in the weeks before Richard's downfall. One rainy evening, as Richard sorted through his growing file of evidence in a shelter's common room, a young volunteer noticed his papers. The man introduced himself as David Chen, a junior reporter for a small local news blog. Unlike the major media outlets that had condemned Richard without investigation, Chen showed genuine interest in the complex web of corruption Richard had uncovered. But just as hope began to flicker, Sterling and Wells played their final card. Anonymous sources provided major newspapers with documents appearing to show Richard attempting to bribe officials during his investigation. The stories painted him as a desperate man fabricating conspiracy theories to avoid responsibility for his crimes. The shelter asked him to leave, concerned about the media attention. David Chen's editor killed the story, citing liability concerns. Even the library, his last refuge, revoked his computer privileges after complaints about his suspicious behavior. Sitting on a park bench in the rain, Richard held Sarah's gold star, now worn and creased from constant handling. The small paper star represented the only genuine kindness he'd experienced since his fall. He had tried to fight back through legal channels, through the media, through the system, and the system had crushed him at every turn. But as he watched city lights reflect off the wet pavement, Richard realized he had been fighting the wrong way. Sterling and Wells expected him to act like a CEO, to work through official channels they controlled. They weren't prepared for what a man with nothing left to lose might do when he stopped playing by their rules. In that moment, as rain soaked through his threadbare coat, Richard Thompson made a decision that would change everything. He would stop trying to reclaim his old life and start working to expose the truth, no matter the personal cost. Sometimes he realized you have to lose everything to see what really matters. Sterling and Wells' final assault on Richard Thompson's life was executed with surgical precision. Over several weeks, they systematically dismantled every foundation of his personal and professional existence, ensuring his complete isolation and financial ruin. The orchestrated bankruptcy began with a series of anonymous complaints to federal regulators about suspicious patterns in Richard's personal investments. Wells had spent months creating a complex trail of fraudulent transactions, making it appear as if Richard had been embezzling company funds through a network of shell companies. The evidence was so meticulously fabricated that even Richard's personal accountant couldn't immediately detect the deception. Elizabeth's departure was carefully engineered. Sterling arranged for concerned employees to contact her with stories about Richard's supposed affairs and financial improprieties. These whispers were supported by doctored hotel receipts, manipulated surveillance photos, and faked expense reports. The final blow came when they sent her fabricated evidence suggesting Richard had been gambling away Emma's college fund. Their daughter Emma, already struggling with her father's constant absences, received an anonymous email containing edited video clips of Richard appearing to mock her swimming achievements at a board meeting. The video, skillfully manipulated from different corporate events, devastated the teenager. When Elizabeth announced their move to London, Emma didn't even say goodbye to her father. The bankruptcy proceedings were a masterpiece of legal manipulation. Sterling and Wells had planted their own people in the bankruptcy court, ensuring that every decision went against Richard. His assets were frozen, then systematically stripped away. The mansion was seized, his vehicles repossessed, and his investments liquidated at a fraction of their value, with Sterling and Wells shell companies conveniently positioned to purchase everything at fire sale prices. Their influence extended beyond the financial realm. Richard's social circle evaporated as rumors spread through Chicago's elite circles. Country club memberships were revoked, charity board positions eliminated, and social invitations dried up. Former friends crossed the street to avoid him, their own positions too precarious to risk association with a fallen titan. The psychological warfare was equally calculated. Every time Richard tried to reach out to Emma, his messages were intercepted and replaced with cruel responses crafted by Wells' team. Elizabeth's lawyers bombarded him with threatening letters, restraining orders, and legal actions, all designed to maintain his isolation. Even his attempt to visit his father's grave was thwarted when the cemetery's security was instructed to consider him a threat. His final attempt to maintain some dignity renting a small apartment with his remaining cash was undermined when Sterling's associates pressured the landlord to evict him, citing concerns about criminal elements. Each small humiliation was designed to break his spirit, to transform the proud CEO into a broken man no one would believe. The media campaign against him reached new heights of cruelty. Paparazzi photographed him sleeping on benches. Local news ran stories about his mental decline, and business publications used his fall as a cautionary tale of corporate corruption. Every attempt he made to defend himself was twisted into evidence of his guilt. Most painful was the systematic destruction of his reputation at the company his father had founded. Long-time employees were given a choice: publicly denounce Richard or lose their pensions. Photos of him were removed from the lobby, his name stripped from company records, and a memo circulated attributing every success in the company's history to Sterling and Wells' leadership. The final piece of their plan was ensuring Richard's complete financial destitution. Any potential employer who might have offered him work received anonymous warnings about liability issues. His professional licenses were suspended pending investigation. Even his personal bank accounts were frozen under suspicion of money laundering, leaving him without access to basic necessities. Within months, Richard Thompson, once one of Chicago's most respected business leaders, was reduced to sleeping in shelters and standing in soup kitchen lines. But Sterling and Wells watched from their penthouse offices as their former boss became just another homeless man on the streets their company helped build. What they couldn't have anticipated was that this complete destruction of Richard's life would lead him to that specific doorway on that snowy evening, where a little girl's act of kindness would give him something they couldn't take away: a reason to fight back. The gold star she gave him became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in their perfectly orchestrated destruction, they had left one loose thread: the truth about John Miller's death and all the others they had buried. In their arrogance, Sterling and Wells believed they had created the perfect downfall. Instead, they had inadvertently given Richard the one thing he needed most: nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The diagnosis came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Mary Miller had collapsed during her shift at Joey's Diner, and the free clinic's verdict was devastating: stage 3 cancer, already spreading. For 12-year-old Sarah, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in her already challenging life, becoming not just a student, but her mother's primary caregiver. The apartment that had once felt small now became a maze of medical supplies. Sarah learned to organize pill bottles by schedule, to change IV bags with careful precision, and to help her mother to and from the bathroom during particularly rough nights after chemotherapy. Her homework station moved from the kitchen table to the floor beside her mother's bed, where she could study while monitoring Mary's breathing. School became a complex balancing act. Sarah would wake at 5 a.m. to prepare her mother's morning medications and make breakfast, usually plain toast, all Mary could keep down. She'd leave precise instructions for the kind elderly neighbor who watched her mother during school hours, along with emergency contact numbers written in her neat, childish handwriting. In class, Sarah fought to stay awake, often having spent nights holding her mother's hand through waves of pain. Her teachers noticed the dark circles under her eyes but mistook them for signs of teenage rebellion rather than exhaustion from being a young caregiver. When her grades began to slip, concerned emails went unanswered. Mary was too sick to check her inbox, and Sarah was too overwhelmed to explain. The financial strain grew unbearable. Medical bills piled up, even with the clinic's sliding scale fees. Sarah began taking odd jobs, babysitting, delivering newspapers, helping at the local thrift store. Every dollar went into a tin can labeled Mom's medicine hidden under her bed. She learned to bargain at the pharmacy, to research generic alternatives, to calculate copays and deductibles with the expertise of an insurance adjuster. The social worker who visited monthly praised Sarah's maturity while expressing concern about her situation. There was talk of foster care, of professional care facilities, of giving Sarah her childhood back. But Sarah fought against any suggestion of separation. The memory of giving away their last loaf of bread years ago had taught her that sometimes the hardest choice was also the right one. Her mother's sick days became a cruel teacher. Sarah learned to recognize the subtle changes in Mary's breathing that preceded a bad spell, to distinguish between different types of pain by the way her mother's fingers twisted in the bedsheets. She became fluent in medical terminology, discussing white blood cell counts and radiation schedules with doctors who often didn't realize they were talking to a child. School projects took on new meaning. For biology, she researched cancer treatments, hoping to understand her mother's illness better. Her math skills improved through calculating medication dosages and managing their tight budget. Even her English essays reflected her new reality, writing about caregiving, about finding strength in impossible situations, about the true meaning of family. The physical toll was matched by emotional exhaustion. Sarah learned to cry silently in the shower, where her mother couldn't hear. She kept a brave face during hospital visits, telling jokes and sharing school stories while her mother received treatments. At night she would curl up with her father's old work jacket, allowing herself brief moments of being just a scared little girl who missed her dad and feared losing her mom too. Yet amid the struggle there were moments of grace. The diner where Mary had worked sent home meals twice a week. Mrs. Anderson, the school librarian, began packing extra sandwiches in Sarah's free lunch, pretending not to notice when Sarah saved them for dinner. The pharmacy technician would sometimes find discount coupons for Mary's medications, winking at Sarah as she applied them. Sarah's determination never wavered, but her dreams shifted focus. The goal of becoming a doctor no longer seemed like a distant fantasy, it became a burning necessity. She studied medical journals during hospital waiting rooms, asked nurses to explain procedures, and kept detailed notes on her mother's treatment. Every challenge became a lesson, every challenge became a lesson, every setback a reason to work harder. The most difficult moments came when her mother would apologize for being sick, for needing help, for not being the parent she wanted to be. Sarah would take her mother's thin hands, remembering how these same hands had once braided her hair and packed her lunches, and tell her the same thing: we're Millers. We take care of each other. Through it all, Sarah kept her father's photo by her bed, talking to it late at night when the weight of responsibility felt crushing. She imagined him watching over them, proud of how she'd stepped up to care for her mother. The gold stars she once earned for academics now came from nurses who praised her gentle way with her mother, her attention to detail in monitoring symptoms, her unwavering dedication. What Sarah couldn't know was that her daily struggles were preparing her for an even greater challenge ahead, one that would require all the strength, resilience and compassion she was developing. The homeless man she had helped years ago was about to re-enter her life, bringing with him both the key to justice for her father and a test of her capacity for forgiveness. Homelessness stripped away every vestige of Richard Thompson's former life, replacing board meetings with bread lines and shareholder reports with shelter intake forms. Yet in this harsh new reality, he discovered something his years of wealth had never taught him: the true measure of human dignity. His first weeks on the street were a crash course in survival. He learned which shelters were safest, which soup kitchens served the best meals, which libraries stayed open latest. The gold star from Sarah, carefully preserved in a plastic bag, became his talisman. On particularly cold nights when even the shelters were full, he would hold it and remember the simple kindness that had given him purpose. The transformation from CEO to homeless investigator required a complete reinvention. Richard cultivated a deliberate invisibility, learning to blend into backgrounds where his former employees wouldn't recognize him. He grew a beard, wore layers of donated clothes, and adapted the shuffling gait of someone society preferred not to see. In the homeless community, he found unexpected allies. Tom, a former accountant who'd lost everything to addiction, helped him analyze financial documents in exchange for shared meals. Maria, who cleaned office buildings at night, began collecting discarded papers from Thompson Construction's trash, providing crucial pieces of evidence. The public library became his unofficial office. Librarians who had once seen him as just another homeless patron began to notice his methodical research, his careful note-taking, his respectful treatment of books and computers. One librarian, Ms. Chen, even began saving business sections of newspapers for him, recognizing his particular interest in construction industry news. Richard's investigation took on a new dimension when he started attending worker advocacy meetings. Here, in church basements and community centers, he heard stories that mirrored John Miller's tales of unsafe conditions, ignored complaints, and retribution against whistleblowers. Each story added weight to his growing case against Sterling and Wells. His lowest point came during a bitter February night when all shelters were full. Huddled in a parking garage, he contemplated giving up, accepting his fall from grace as karma for his years of negligence. But that same night, he witnessed a homeless veteran share his only blanket with a teenage runaway. The echo of Sarah's kindness in this simple act renewed his resolve. Richard began documenting safety violations at Thompson construction sites, photographing hazards with a cheap disposable camera. He created a network of day laborers who would report conditions anonymously, building a contemporary record to support his historical evidence. Each new piece of information was carefully coded and hidden in various library books, a distributed archive that Sterling and Wells couldn't easily destroy. The hardest lesson was learning to accept help. Pride had initially prevented him from taking handouts, but hunger and cold proved powerful teachers. But each act of kindness, a shared sandwich, a spare pair of socks, a word of encouragement reminded him of how he had failed to see the humanity in others when he had the power to help. His daughter Emma's birthday hit him particularly hard. Sitting in the library, he wrote her a letter he knew he couldn't send, explaining everything not to justify his past actions, but to show her that even fallen men can find purpose in helping others. He sealed it in an envelope marked with her name, adding it to his growing file of evidence. Gradually, Richard developed a reputation among the homeless community as someone who would listen and help. He used his business knowledge to help others navigate social services, fill out job applications, and understand legal documents. Each person he helped became another set of eyes and ears in his investigation. The turning point came when he helped a young construction worker document unsafe conditions at his job site. The worker's smartphone photos revealed Sterling and Wells' cost-cutting measures were still endangering lives. More importantly, they showed the same patterns that had led to John Miller's death, creating a direct link between past and present violations. Richard's redemption wasn't in grand gestures but in small acts of justice. He began anonymously reporting safety violations to OSHA, using his insider knowledge to pinpoint where to look. He helped injured workers connect with pro bono lawyers, sharing his understanding of corporate tactics. Each small victory chipped away at the corrupt system he had unwittingly helped build. As his case against Sterling and Wells grew stronger, Richard never forgot the lessons Sarah had taught him about compassion. He shared his food when he had it, offered his spot in shelter lines to those who needed it more, and maintained his humanity in a system designed to strip it away. The gold star, now worn and creased, remained his most precious possession. It represented not just the kindness that had saved him, but the person he was trying to become, someone who would make that little girl's faith in human goodness worthwhile. What he didn't yet know was that his path would soon cross again with Sarah's, bringing both justice and healing in ways neither could imagine. As Chicago's seasons changed, Sarah Miller and Richard Thompson lived their separate lives, unknowingly connected by threads of fate and shared purpose. Their paths nearly crossed numerous times, each near meeting a reminder of how closely intertwined their stories had become. One autumn morning, Sarah sat in the hospital waiting room while her mother received chemotherapy. Just outside, Richard was documenting unsafe conditions at the hospital's construction site, his worn notebook filled with observations about the same contractors who had worked on the project where John Miller died. Neither knew that only a wall separated them, or that their mutual quest for justice was slowly converging. At the public library, Sarah would study medical texts in the same quiet corner where Richard had spent hours building his case just hours before. Ms. Chen, the librarian who helped them both, often remarked on their similar dedication, a young girl determined to understand her mother's illness, and a homeless man methodically researching corporate law. She never made the connection between them, though she sometimes wondered about the gold star she'd seen Richard carefully protect. Their parallel struggles manifested in different ways. While Sarah learned to calculate medication dosages, Richard was calculating the human cost of corporate negligence. As she documented her mother's symptoms, he documented patterns of corruption. But both fought against systems too big for one person to change, yet neither considered giving up. Their lives intersected in other subtle ways. The same social worker who checked on Sarah's family also helped Richard navigate shelter services. The free clinic where Mary received treatment was where Richard went when winter temperatures led to frostbite. The diner where Mary had worked, and which still sent meals to the Millers, was where Richard sometimes found day work cleaning dishes. Both found unlikely allies in their struggles. Sarah's network included Mrs. Anderson, the school librarian who slipped extra food into her backpack, and Dr. Rodriguez, who provided medical samples to help with Mary's treatment. Richard's allies included Tom, the former accountant, and Maria, the office cleaner who gathered evidence. Unknown to them, these separate support networks sometimes overlapped, creating an invisible web of compassion throughout the city. Their shared geography told its own story. The construction site where John Miller died was visible from the hospital window where Mary received treatment. The homeless shelter where Richard often slept was just blocks from the Miller's apartment. They shopped at the same discount grocery store, Sarah counting pennies for her mother's food while Richard collected discarded receipts that proved Thompson Construction's ongoing safety violations. The impact of their initial meeting continued to ripple through their lives. Sarah's act of giving away the bread had taught her that helping others brought its own kind of healing, leading her to share what little they had with neighbors in need. For Richard, that moment of kindness had become his moral compass, guiding his efforts to expose corruption and protect other workers from John Miller's fate. Their daily routines sometimes brought them tantalizingly close. Sarah would hurry past the library during her paper route, just as Richard was settling in for his morning research. He would document safety violations at construction sites near her school, while she studied inside, dreaming of becoming a doctor who would help people like her mother. Even their personal transformations mirrored each other. Sarah was growing from a child into a caregiver, learning strength through adversity. Richard was changing from a corporate executive into an advocate for justice, finding purpose in helping others. Both carried deep wounds: her father's death, his family's abandonment, yet these wounds drove them to prevent others from suffering similar fates. The city itself seemed to weave their stories together. The same winter winds that made Sarah worry about heating bills forced Richard to seek shelter. The spring rains that leaked through the miller's roof drove Richard to document similar maintenance neglect in Thompson Construction's properties. Summer heat that made Mary's treatments more difficult had Richard investigating unsafe working conditions at outdoor sites. Their separate investigations were slowly converging. Sarah's careful recording of her mother's medical expenses created a paper trail that would later support Richard's case about healthcare cost-cutting. His growing file of safety violations would eventually help explain the circumstances of John Miller's death. Neither realized they were building complementary pieces of the same puzzle. What they could not know was how close they were to discovering their connection. The truth about John Miller's death, the corruption at Thompson Construction, and the chance encounter that had saved Richard's life were all moving toward a revelation that would change both their lives forever. The Gold Star, kept safe through countless nights on the streets, would soon complete its journey home, bringing with it both justice and healing for two souls unknowingly bound by fate and compassion. The revelation came on a spring morning in the hospital waiting room. Richard had been following a lead about falsified worker compensation claims when he overheard a conversation that stopped him cold. A nurse was discussing a young girl who took care of her cancer-stricken mother, a woman whose husband had died at a Thompson construction site. "That Miller girl," the nurse said, "barely 13, but handles her mother's care better than some professionals. Hard to believe it's been 6 years since they lost her father in that construction accident." Richard froze, his worn notebook falling from suddenly numb fingers. The name Miller echoed in his mind, connecting to documents he'd seen hundreds of times. John Miller's death, the case that had started his investigation, the accident that Sterling and Wells had used to frame him. And now, a daughter who took care of her sick mother. With trembling hands, he pulled out the gold star he'd carried for years. The memory of that snowy night came rushing back: a little girl sharing her last loaf of bread, offering her coat, speaking about her father in heaven. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. The child who had saved his life was John Miller's daughter. Over the next few days, Richard discreetly observed Sarah and Mary from a distance. He watched Sarah expertly managing her mother's medications, saw her studying medical texts during treatment sessions, noticed how she seemed to carry the weight of adulthood on her young shoulders. Each observation twisted the knife of guilt deeper. The full impact of his past negligence confronted him in human terms. This child's struggles, her poverty, her lost childhood, her daily battle to keep her mother alive, all stemmed from his failure to oversee his company properly. The corporate negligence he'd investigated took on a personal face, one that had shown him kindness when he least deserved it. His investigation files now seemed inadequate. Pages of evidence and legal documents couldn't capture the real cost of corporate greed: a young girl forced to grow up too fast, a family shattered by preventable tragedy. The gold star in his pocket, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a burning reminder of his complicity. Late one night, in the library where he'd spent countless hours building his case, Richard made a devastating discovery. Buried in old email threads was a safety report about the scaffolding at John Miller's work site. The report, sent a week before the accident, had been marked for his urgent attention but was diverted by Sterling and Wells. He could have prevented John Miller's death if he'd only paid closer attention. The weight of this knowledge nearly broke him. Richard spent hours walking the city streets, wrestling with the question of whether to reveal himself to Sarah and Mary. Would his help be seen as redemption, or just another cruel reminder of their loss? More importantly, did he have the right to disrupt their lives again? The decision was made for him when he witnessed Sarah struggling with medical bills at the hospital payment window. The clerk was unsympathetic to her tears as she tried to explain that they couldn't afford the latest round of treatments. Richard watched as she pulled out a jar labeled Mom's Medicine, counting pennies and crumpled dollars with shaking hands. In that moment, seeing Sarah's desperate attempt to save her mother, Richard understood what he had to do. It wasn't enough to expose Sterling and Wells, to clear his name, or even to reform the company. He owed this family a personal debt that went beyond corporate responsibility or legal obligations. He began formulating a plan, one that would require him to risk everything he'd built in his investigation. The evidence he'd gathered could bring down Sterling and Wells, but it could also reopen wounds for the Miller family. Sarah's kindness had saved him from despair. Now he had to find a way to help her without causing more pain. The final piece fell into place when he overheard Sarah talking to her mother about her dream of becoming a doctor. "Like the one who helped Dad," she said softly. "So other families won't have to go through what we did." Her words crystallized his purpose. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, but about healing the wounds they'd caused. Richard tucked the gold star back into his pocket, feeling its worn edges like a promise. The time had come to bridge the gap between past and present, between guilt and redemption. He would find a way to help this family, not as the former CEO of Thompson Construction, but as the homeless man whose life had been changed by a child's compassion. That evening, as he watched Sarah helping her exhausted mother from the hospital to catch their bus, Richard made his decision. Tomorrow he would begin the process of revealing the truth, not just about Thompson Construction's corruption, but about who he was and how a little girl's kindness had set him on the path to redemption. The confrontation unfolded in the hospital's small chapel, where Sarah often went to find moments of peace between her mother's treatments. Richard had chosen this place carefully, hoping its sacred walls would provide some comfort for the difficult revelations to come. Sarah Miller, his voice was gentle, but she startled at the sound of her name. Turning, she recognized him immediately, the homeless man from that snowy night years ago. Before she could speak, he pulled out the worn gold star she had given him. "You kept it." Her voice wavered between surprise and confusion. The sight of her childhood gift, carefully preserved through years of hardship, stirred something in her memory. She moved closer, studying his face with growing recognition. "I did more than keep it," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It saved my life. But Sarah, there's something you need to know." He paused, gathering courage. "My name is Richard Thompson. I was the CEO of Thompson Construction when your father died." The impact of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her young face transforming from confusion to horror to rage. You're the one who..." Her voice broke as years of suppressed anger found their target. "The one who failed your father." "Yes." Richard remained standing, accepting her anger as his due. "But I'm also the one who spent the last 6 years gathering evidence of what really happened that day." He slowly opened his worn notebook, revealing hundreds of pages of documented corruption. Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at the evidence. "They said he was drunk," she whispered. "They made everyone believe he was responsible for his own death." Years of schoolyard taunts and whispered accusations echoed in her words. "Your father was a hero," Richard said firmly. "He was trying to document unsafe conditions that day. Sterling and Wells, my executives, they covered it up. They've been running a corrupt operation for years, putting profits over people's lives. I was too blind, too focused on expansion to see what was happening under my nose." As he spoke, Richard carefully laid out the evidence he'd gathered: the falsified safety reports, the diverted emails, the pattern of accidents and cover-ups. Sarah listened with growing comprehension, her medical training helping her understand the detailed documentation. "Why now?" she demanded. "Why did you wait so long?" The accusation in her voice was tempered by confusion as she struggled to reconcile the homeless man she'd helped with the former CEO responsible for her family's tragedy. "Because I had to understand the full scope of their corruption," Richard explained. "And because I needed to become someone worthy of telling you the truth. Your kindness that night, giving your last loaf of bread to a stranger, it showed me what real humanity looks like. It made me realize how far I'd strayed from my father's values. The mention of bread triggered something in Sarah's memory. That night. You were going to... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Richard nodded, understanding her unspoken question. I was at my lowest point. Your kindness gave me a reason to live, to fight back. Every time I wanted to give up, I looked at this star and remembered there was still goodness in the world worth fighting for. Sarah sank into a chapel pew, overwhelmed by the revelations. All these years while Mum and I struggled, while she got sick, you were gathering evidence to bring down the people truly responsible for your father's death, Richard finished. But I know that doesn't make up for what you've lost. Nothing can. A long silence filled the chapel. Sarah stared at the gold star in her hands, remembering the little girl who had given it away, believing in the goodness of strangers. Finally, she looked up at Richard. Show me everything, she said quietly. I want to understand what happened to my father. For the next hour, Richard shared his complete investigation. He explained how Sterling and Wells had systematically dismantled safety protocols, how they'd framed him when he started asking questions, how they'd destroyed his life to protect their scheme. As the truth unfolded, Sarah's medical training helped her spot patterns in the documentation that even Richard had missed. Her years of managing her mother's healthcare had given her insights into the human cost of corporate negligence. They're still doing it, aren't they? She asked, her voice hardening with determination. Still putting workers at risk? Richard nodded grimly. But with your help, we can stop them. Your father tried to expose the truth. Together, we can finish what he started. Sarah stood, squaring her shoulders in a gesture that reminded Richard painfully of John Miller. For my father, she said softly, then added, and for every other family they've hurt. As they left the chapel, both knew that this confrontation was just the beginning. The truth had been revealed, but justice was still waiting to be served. The Gold Star had completed its journey, bringing together two unlikely allies in a fight for redemption and justice. In the days following their chapel confrontation, Sarah found herself caught in an emotional tempest. Every morning she would wake up to find two warring impulses in her heart: the burning desire for justice that demanded retribution, and the compassionate spirit her father had instilled in her that whispered of forgiveness. Mary noticed the change in her daughter immediately. Sarah's usual quiet efficiency in managing medications and treatments was now punctuated by moments of distant contemplation. When Mary finally asked what was troubling her, Sarah broke down and revealed everything about Richard Thompson and his investigation. He was responsible. Mom Sarah sobbed, curled up on their worn couch. He was in charge when Dad died. But he's also the homeless man I gave our bread to that night. The one you always said proved there was still good in the world. The irony of her mother's words now felt like a cruel joke. Mary's reaction surprised her daughter. Instead of anger, her face showed a complex mixture of emotions. Your father always said there were no simple villains in life, she said softly. Only people who either chose to learn from their mistakes or didn't. Sarah spent hours in the hospital chapel, wrestling with her feelings. She would stare at the gold star Richard had returned to her, trying to reconcile the corrupt CEO with the broken man who had kept a child's gift as his most precious possession. The star, now worn and creased, seemed to embody the complexity of human nature, how the same person could be both the source of their pain and potentially their salvation. The evidence Richard had gathered was undeniable. Page after page documented not just the corruption that had killed her father, but Richard's own transformation from negligent executive to determined justice seeker. Sarah's medical training had taught her about healing, but nothing had prepared her for the challenge of healing her own wounded heart. Late one night, while sitting with her sleeping mother in the hospital, Sarah witnessed a moment that shifted her perspective. Richard, unaware of her presence, was quietly talking to an injured construction worker in the emergency room, helping him document safety violations that mirrored her father's case. The genuine concern in his voice, The careful way he protected the worker's identity spoke of a man who had truly changed. The turning point came when Sarah discovered Richard's hidden acts of kindness. Through discreet inquiries, she learned how he had been using his knowledge of corporate systems to help other workers' families navigate insurance claims and legal challenges. He had created an underground network of support, all while living on the streets himself. Yet anger would still ambush her at unexpected moments. Watching her mother struggle through chemotherapy, knowing they couldn't afford better treatment, the old rage would flare. During these times, Sarah would remember her father's words about the difference between justice and revenge, how one healed while the other poisoned the soul. Richard, for his part, never asked for forgiveness. He simply continued his work, sharing all his findings with Sarah, respecting her need to process the truth in her own way. His humility, paradoxically, made it both easier and harder to hold on to hatred. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult night for Mary. The cancer treatments had left her severely dehydrated, and Sarah was struggling to manage her care. Richard, having learned of the situation, appeared with the specialist contact information and a way to access an emergency medical fund she hadn't known existed. As she watched him quietly help her mother without expecting anything in return, Sarah finally understood something profound about forgiveness. It wasn't about excusing past actions or forgetting pain, it was about choosing to see the full humanity of someone who had caused harm but was genuinely trying to make amends. "I don't forgive the man who ran Thompson Construction 6 years ago," she told Richard the next day. "But I do trust the man who kept my gold star and is fighting for justice now." The distinction was subtle but crucial, acknowledging both his past failures and his present redemption. The decision to work with Richard didn't come easily, but it came with certainty. Sarah realized that continuing to hate him would only detract from their shared goal of exposing Sterling and Wells' ongoing corruption. More importantly, it would dishonor her father's memory, a man who had died trying to protect others. Their alliance, forged in the crucible of shared pain and purpose, began to transform both of them. Sarah found her medical knowledge becoming an unexpected asset in documenting health and safety violations. But Richard's corporate expertise, combined with her understanding of human suffering, created a powerful force for change. Together, they began building a case that was about more than just exposing corruption. It was about healing the wounds that corporate greed had inflicted on countless families. The gold star, now framed and hanging in Sarah's room, served as a reminder that sometimes the path to justice required both righteous anger and the capacity for forgiveness. The winter brought with it a cruel deterioration in Mary Miller's health. The aggressive cancer, temporarily held at bay by months of treatment, launched a renewed assault on her weakened body. Sarah noticed the change's first subtle shifts in her mother's breathing, new lines of pain around her eyes, the way her hands trembled even when resting. Dr. Rodriguez delivered the news in his gentle, accented voice. The cancer had spread to Mary's liver. The current treatment protocol was no longer effective, and the more aggressive options they needed were far beyond the Millers' financial reach. Sarah sat in the consultation room, her medical knowledge now a curse as she understood exactly what each test result meant. The decline was rapid and merciless. Mary could no longer keep food down, surviving on ice chips and occasional sips of broth that Sarah prepared. The small apartment became a makeshift hospital room, with Sarah sleeping on the floor beside her mother's bed, alert to every change in breathing, every murmur of discomfort. The hospital visits became more frequent and desperate. Sarah learned to recognize the pitying looks from emergency room staff as she brought her mother in again and again, each time a little weaker. The social worker suggested hospice care, but they couldn't afford it. The words comfort measures only began appearing in Mary's medical charts, a clinical euphemism for surrender. Between caring for her mother and maintaining her investigation with Richard, Sarah barely slept. She would study her medical texts during her mother's brief periods of rest, desperately searching for alternative treatments, clinical trials, anything that might help. Her notebook, filled with medical terms and treatment protocols mixed with evidence of corporate corruption, as if solving one might somehow help with the other. Mary, in her lucid moments, worried more about Sarah than herself. She would watch her daughter measuring medications, changing bedding, preparing simple meals, all while trying to keep up with her schoolwork. "You're too young for all this," she would whisper, to which Sarah would reply with their family motto, "We're Millers. We take care of each other." But the nights were the worst. Pain medications would wear off in the early hours, and Mary's whimpers would fill the darkness. Sarah learned to administer morphine with steady hands, even as her heart shattered at her mother's suffering. During these long nights, she would sometimes catch Richard's shadow outside their window, keeping a silent vigil, offering what protection he could. Financial reality added another layer of cruelty. Each new medication depleted their meager savings faster. Sarah began selling anything of value: her father's watch, her mother's wedding ring with Mary's insistence, even her beloved medical textbooks. Each sale felt like trading pieces of their history for a few more days of life. The school tried to be understanding, but Sarah's grades continued to slip. She missed classes for hospital visits, turned in assignments late, and fell asleep during tests. Only Mrs. Anderson, the librarian, seemed to truly understand, quietly providing her a safe space to study during lunch periods and slipping her protein bars when she noticed Sarah skipping meals. Mary's coherent moments became precious rarities. She would use these times to share memories of John, to give Sarah advice about life, to make sure her daughter knew how proud both her parents were of her. Sarah recorded these conversations in her heart, even as she noted her mother's declining vital signs in her medical log. The cruelest moment came when Mary, in a moment of clarity, made Sarah promise not to let her illness destroy her future. "Your father wanted you to become a doctor," she whispered. "Don't let us be the reason you give up that dream." Sarah made the promise, even though she couldn't imagine how she would keep it. Through it all, Sarah maintained her father's photo by her mother's bedside, positioned so Mary could see it easily. Sometimes, in her pain medication haze, Mary would talk to John as if he were there, apologizing for leaving their daughter too soon, begging him to watch over her. What neither Mary nor Sarah knew was that Richard, witnessing their struggle, had begun making calls to his few remaining contacts in the medical world. The man who had once signed papers without reading them was now spending his days researching experimental treatments and advocacy programs, determined not to let another Miller suffer from his past negligence. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Disgraced CEO found living among homeless, claims corporate conspiracy. David Chen's article, published in his small local news blog, quickly caught fire across social media. Within hours, major news networks descended on Chicago, transforming the quiet tragedy of the Millers into a sensational headline. The media frenzy erupted with devastating force. Reporters camped outside the Millers' apartment building, their cameras trained on every entrance. They ambushed Sarah on her way to school, shoving microphones in her face, demanding to know how she felt about her father's drunk working story being challenged. Each flash of their cameras felt like another assault on her family's privacy. Sterling and Wells launched an immediate counteroffensive. Their Puerto Rico machine painted Richard as a delusional former executive, using a grieving family's tragedy to attempt a comeback. They released carefully selected documents suggesting John Miller had a history of workplace infractions, forcing Sarah to defend her father's memory on national television. The hospital became a battleground. Reporters tried to slip into Mary's room disguised as visitors, hoping to catch the dramatic sight of the dying mother whose story had captured public attention. Security had to be posted outside her door, adding another layer of stress to her already difficult treatments. Local news dug up old neighbors and co-workers, each offering their version of events from 6 years ago. Some defended John Miller as a conscientious worker, others repeated the company's narrative about his supposed negligence. The contradicting stories played out in split-screen debates on cable news, turning personal tragedy into public entertainment. Social media exploded with competing hashtags Justice for Miller and Thompson Lee's trending against disgraced CCO scam and Miller truth. Sarah's old social media accounts were discovered, her childhood posts about missing her father now dissected by strangers arguing about corporate responsibility and worker safety. The story took an uglier turn when anonymous sources began suggesting that Sarah's act of kindness toward Richard had been staged, part of an elaborate plot to extort the company. Internet sleuths analyzed security camera footage from nearby buildings, trying to prove or disprove the bread-sharing incident from years ago. Richard's homelessness became a subject of morbid fascination. News channels ran special features comparing his former mansion to the shelters where he now slept. Financial experts debated whether his fall from grace was genuine or an elaborate act. His ex-wife Elizabeth was tracked down in London, offering a scathing interview about his pattern of deception. The pressure began affecting Sarah's school life in new ways. Some teachers treated her with uncomfortable sympathy, while others seemed skeptical of the media attention. Classmates either avoided her entirely or tried to befriend her for proximity to fame. The sanctuary of education she had fought so hard to maintain was now tainted by public scrutiny. Mary's condition worsened under the stress of constant media attention. The noise of reporters outside made rest impossible, and the constant stream of stories about John's death forced her to relive the trauma repeatedly. Sarah watched helplessly as her mother's vital signs reflected each new wave of public interest. Through it all, Sarah maintained a dignified silence, speaking only through a brief statement, "My father was a good man who died trying to protect others." That truth doesn't need defending. Her composure in the face of media chaos earned her unexpected allies, with several prominent journalists beginning to question the corporate narrative. The gold star became a symbol in the public narrative. Photos of the worn paper star appeared on magazine covers, accompanied by headlines asking whether a child's act of kindness could bring down a corporate giant. Some questioned its authenticity, while others saw it as a powerful symbol of humanity in the face of corporate greed. Richard faced his own media gauntlet with quiet determination. When confronted by aggressive reporters, he would simply state, "This isn't about me. It's about justice for the Miller family and every other worker who has been silenced." His refusal to engage in personal vindication slowly began shifting public perception. The media circus threatened to overshadow the real issue, the ongoing corruption at Thompson Construction and the lives still at risk. Sarah and Richard watched as their careful investigation became fodder for 24-hour news cycles, their evidence dissected by talking heads who missed the human cost behind the headlines. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected began to emerge. Workers from other construction companies started coming forward with similar stories. Families who had lost loved ones to corporate negligence began connecting with each other. What had started as one family's tragedy was becoming a movement for worker safety and corporate accountability. The full impact of past decisions crashed down on all parties involved as Mary Miller's condition deteriorated and the media storm intensified. For Richard Thompson, each visit to the hospital was a stark reminder of how his previous negligence had set these tragic events in motion. The sight of Mary's frail form in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped with mechanical indifference, forced him to confront the human cost of corporate indifference. Sterling and Wells felt the pressure mounting as their carefully constructed facade began to crack. Former employees, emboldened by the media attention, started coming forward with their own stories of corruption and coercion. Each new revelation added weight to Richard and Sarah's case, but also revealed the staggering scope of lives affected by their greed. Sarah found herself struggling with the consequences of her own recent choices. Her decision to work with Richard had exposed her mother to additional stress during her final days. Every reporter's question, every suspicious glance from former friends, Every moment spent gathering evidence, instead of at her mother's bedside, felt like a betrayal of sorts. The hospital staff witnessed the toll these pressures took on the Miller family. Nurses who had grown fond of Sarah noticed her increasing exhaustion, the dark circles under her eyes deepening as she tried to balance her mother's care with the growing demands of their fight for justice. Some remembered John Miller's death and the hushed conversations about safety violations that had followed. Mary's lucid moments became precious opportunities for reflection. She would speak to Sarah about John, about forgiveness, about the weight of carrying anger. "Your father never wanted revenge," she would say in her weakened voice. He wanted change. He wanted other families to be safe. These words would echo in Sarah's mind as she sifted through evidence of corporate wrongdoing. For Richard, the weight of his past decisions manifested in unexpected ways. Each time he entered the hospital, he passed construction sites bearing his former company's name. The sight of workers on scaffolding, once just background scenery to his corporate success, now filled him with acute awareness of their vulnerability. He could name safety violations at a glance, violations he had once blindly signed off on. The evidence they had gathered told a story of cascading consequences. One ignored safety report led to another, each overlooked violation emboldening Sterling and Wells to push further. The pattern revealed how small decisions, made in the name of profit, accumulated into catastrophic failures that destroyed lives. Elizabeth's scathing interview had unintended consequences, prompting Emma to reach out to her father for the first time in years. Her message was brief but devastating. "Did you really let someone die because you didn't read the reports?" The weight of having to explain his failures to his daughter added another layer of pain to Richard's redemption journey. The city itself seemed to bear witness to the weight of these past decisions. The Thompson Construction logo, still visible on buildings throughout Chicago, now stood as monuments to corporate greed. Workers at active sites began wearing black armbands in solidarity with John Miller's memory, a silent protest that spoke volumes about the impact of past negligence. Sarah's school records revealed another kind of consequence. Her grades, once exemplary, showed the exact moment her father's death had derailed her academic journey. Teachers' notes documented her transformation from a carefree child to a student bearing adult responsibilities. Each missing assignment and dropped grade was a direct result of choices made in corporate boardrooms years before. Mary's medical files told their own story of consequences. The stress of fighting Thompson Construction had exacerbated her health issues long before the cancer diagnosis. Years of working extra shifts to compensate for lost income had taken their toll on her body. Even her current treatment options were limited by financial constraints stemming from John's death. As evidence mounted and public attention intensified, Sterling and Wells began to experience consequences of their own. Old allies distanced themselves, sensing the shifting tide. Board members started asking uncomfortable questions about safety protocols. The carefully constructed shield of plausible deniability began to crumble under the weight of accumulated lies. The Gold Star, now a symbol in the media narrative, carried its own weight of consequence. For Richard, it represented both his failure as a corporate leader and his chance at redemption. For Sarah, it embodied her choice to trust the man partially responsible for her family's tragedy. For the public, it became a powerful reminder that single acts of kindness or cruelty could have far-reaching implications. In quiet moments at Mary's bedside, Sarah and Richard would sometimes sit in silence, each lost in contemplation of how their past choices had led them to this point. The beeping of medical monitors provided a steady rhythm to their thoughts, a reminder that every decision, every signature, every moment of attention or negligence carried weight that extended far beyond its immediate moment. The breakthrough came hidden in an old maintenance worker's locker at Thompson Construction's main facility. Maria, the night cleaner who had been helping Richard, discovered a dusty envelope tucked behind a loose panel. Inside was a security camera footage backup from the day of John Miller's death, along with handwritten maintenance logs that had supposedly been lost in the company archives. The footage revealed a crucial meeting between John Miller and Richard Thompson that had been deliberately erased from official records. 2 weeks before the accident, John had managed to reach Richard directly, bypassing Sterling and Wells' gatekeeping. The security footage showed John presenting documentation of safety violations and Richard's immediate response issuing direct orders for emergency maintenance and safety upgrades. Further investigation of the maintenance logs showed that Richard's orders had been countermanded by Sterling and Wells through a series of falsified documents. They had forged Richard's signature on papers reversing his safety directives, then buried John's original complaints in bureaucratic red tape. The evidence proved not only their corruption but Richard's active attempts to address the safety concerns that would ultimately lead to John's death. Sarah reviewed the footage in the hospital library, watching her father's last recorded interaction with his CEO. She saw John's passionate gestures as he explained the dangers, recognized his determination to protect his fellow workers. More surprisingly, she saw Richard's immediate concern and action a far cry from the negligent boss she had imagined. The maintenance logs told an even more damning story. Each entry showed a systematic dismantling of safety protocols, with Sterling and Wells redirecting funds meant for repairs into shell companies they controlled. But they also revealed something unexpected: notes from workers about Richard's frequent unannounced site visits, his questions about safety conditions, and his genuine attempts to understand ground-level concerns. Most shocking was the discovery of a half-written email from Richard to John, dated the morning of the accident. Richard had been planning to meet John personally to discuss the safety violations, away from Sterling and Wells' interference. The email was never sent. Sterling and Wells had already begun their plan to silence John permanently. These revelations transformed the narrative completely. Rather than a negligent CEO ignored worker safety, Richard emerged as someone who had tried to help but was deliberately undermined by his corrupt executives. The evidence showed how Sterling and Wells had created an elaborate system to isolate Richard from worker concerns while using his authority to enable their corruption. Mary, watching her daughter process these discoveries from her hospital bed, remembered something she had forgotten in her grief. John mentioned meeting Mr. Thompson, she said softly. He came home hopeful that day, said he'd finally found someone who would listen. The memory added human weight to the documented evidence. The security footage revealed other details that had been hidden: Sterling and Wells' suspicious presence at the construction site the day of the accident, their hurried removal of documents from John's locker immediately after his death, and their careful orchestration of the drunk worker narrative before any investigation could begin. For Sarah, watching her father's last recorded moments alive, passionate, fighting for worker safety, brought both pain and pride. The footage showed the father she remembered principled, caring, determined to protect others. It also showed him being heard and supported by the man she had once blamed for his death. Richard, viewing the evidence with Sarah, finally understood the full scope of his executive's betrayal. They hadn't just killed John Miller, they had deliberately prevented Richard from saving him, then used his death to begin their takedown of Richard himself. The realization brought both clarity and renewed determination to expose the truth. This new evidence did more than just clear Richard's name, it provided the missing link between past and present corruption at Thompson Construction. The same methods used to silence John Miller were still being employed against other workers, creating a clear pattern of ongoing criminal behavior that could finally bring Sterling and Wells to justice. The dominoes began falling on a Monday morning when David Chen published a comprehensive expose on his news blog, backed by the evidence Sarah and Richard had gathered. Within hours, federal investigators arrived at Thompson Construction's headquarters, armed with search warrants and a clear understanding of what they were looking for. Sterling and Wells' carefully constructed world unraveled with stunning speed. The maintenance logs provided a direct paper trail of their corruption, showing how they had systematically diverted safety funds into private accounts. The security footage proved their deliberate efforts to silence whistleblowers, including their role in John Miller's death. Their former allies turned quickly. Mid-level managers facing potential criminal charges began cooperating with investigators. Each new testimony revealed another layer of the conspiracy: falsified safety reports, bribed inspectors, threatened workers, and countless near misses that could have resulted in more deaths. The most damning evidence came from their own computers. Despite their attempts to delete incriminating files, forensic investigators recovered years of correspondence documenting their scheme. Emails showed their calculated plan to frame Richard, their manipulation of evidence after John's death, and their ongoing efforts to maintain their corrupt system. Workers currently employed at Thompson construction sites began coming forward en masse. They shared stories of being forced to work in unsafe conditions, of retribution against those who complained, of injuries covered up and families threatened into silence. Each testimony reinforced the pattern established by John Miller's case. Sarah's medical records of her mother's illness became unexpected evidence, demonstrating the human cost of corporate corruption. The documentation showed how the loss of John's income and insurance had directly impacted Mary's access to healthcare, creating a clear line between Thompson Construction's negligence and the suffering of worker families. The investigation revealed Sterling and Wells' extensive network of corruption. Building inspectors admitted to accepting bribes, insurance adjusters confessed to falsifying claims, and even some law enforcement officials were implicated in covering up safety violations. The conspiracy extended far beyond Thompson Construction's walls. Richard's original safety directives, which Sterling and Wells had buried, emerged from company archives. These documents proved his active efforts to address worker concerns and showed how his executives had systematically undermined these attempts. Each recovered memo added weight to the case against them while vindicating Richard's claims. Local news coverage quickly expanded to national headlines as the scale of the conspiracy became clear. Corporate corruption exposed how greed killed American workers became the leading story across all major networks. Sterling and Wells' carefully maintained public images crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Thompson Construction stock plummeted as investors rushed to distance themselves from the scandal. Major clients suspended contracts pending investigation. The company's reputation, built over generations, faced potential destruction because of two executives' greed. Sarah's role in exposing the truth gained particular attention. Her journey from giving bread to a homeless man to helping expose corporate corruption captured public imagination. Her father's death and her mother's illness became powerful symbols of the human cost of corporate greed. Federal prosecutors moved swiftly, presenting evidence to a grand jury. Sterling and Wells were indicted on multiple charges including criminal negligence, fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy related to John Miller's death. Their attempts to flee the country were thwarted by federal authorities who had been monitoring them since the investigation began. The exposure created a ripple effect throughout the construction industry. Other companies began internal reviews of their safety protocols, fearing similar scandals. Worker advocacy groups gained stronger platforms to demand improved safety measures and accountability. As the conspiracy unraveled, Richard's original vision for Thompson Construction, founded on his father's principles of worker safety and corporate responsibility, stood in stark contrast to what Sterling and Wells had created. The evidence showed not just their corruption, but the betrayal of a company's foundational values. The story became a watershed moment in corporate accountability, proving that no amount of money or influence could permanently hide the truth. For Sarah and Richard, watching Sterling and Wells led away in handcuffs marked the beginning of justice for John Miller and countless other workers who had suffered under their regime. In the wake of the corporate conspiracy's exposure, Sarah found herself wrestling with complex emotions in the quiet of her mother's hospital room. The vindication of her father's name brought a sense of justice, but it also forced her to confront her feelings about Richard Thompson's role in their family's tragedy. Mary's condition had stabilized somewhat, giving her moments of clarity to discuss the revelations with her daughter. "Your father always said that forgiveness isn't about forgetting," she told Sarah during one of these lucid periods. "It's about choosing to see the whole person, not just their mistakes." Sarah spent hours reviewing the evidence they had gathered. The security footage of her father's meeting with Richard played on repeat in her mind, her father's passionate advocacy for worker safety, Richard's genuine concern and immediate action to help. It challenged her long-held image of a callous CEO who had ignored workers' safety for profit. The discovery of Richard's thwarted attempts to help her father created an uncomfortable cognitive dissonance. She had spent years directing her anger at him, finding some comfort in having a clear target for her grief. Now, understanding his actual role forced her to redirect that anger towards Sterling and Wells while confronting her feelings about Richard. The gold star she had given him years ago took on new meaning. What she had seen as a simple act of childhood kindness had become a catalyst for exposing corruption and achieving justice. Yet it also symbolized the complexity of human nature, how someone could be both complicit in tragedy through negligence and instrumental in bringing about justice through redemption. Late one night, watching Richard organize legal documents while sitting in the hospital corridor, Sarah made her decision. She saw not the former CEO of Thompson Construction, but a man who had lost everything, lived on the streets, and dedicated years to uncovering the truth, all sparked by a child's act of kindness. "I understand now," she told him, sitting down beside him. "You're not the man who failed to prevent my father's death. You're the man who helped me prove why he died." The distinction was crucial to her ability to move forward, to channel her energy into ensuring other families wouldn't suffer as hers had. Their shared mission to expose Sterling and Wells had created an unexpected bond. Sarah recognized that working with Richard wasn't betraying her father's memory, it was honoring it by fighting for the safety measures he had died trying to implement. The media attention brought pressure to tell their story differently, to paint Richard as either a complete villain or a total hero. But Sarah insisted on telling the complex truth about a man who had failed through negligence, fallen through corruption, and found redemption through a child's kindness. Mary's perspective proved crucial to Sarah's decision. "Your father would be proud," she said, watching news coverage of the conspiracy's exposure. "Not just of exposing the truth, but of your ability to see beyond anger to what really matters, protecting other workers and their families." As federal prosecutors prepared their case against Sterling and Wells, Sarah made peace with her role in the story. She would testify not just about her father's death, but about the transformation she had witnessed in Richard Thompson, from the CEO who had failed her father to the ally who had helped achieve justice. The gold star, now framed alongside a photo of her father, served as a reminder that justice and healing often came through unexpected channels. Sarah's decision to work with Richard hadn't erased the past, but it had helped create a future where her father's death might prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedy. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of Sterling and Wells' sentencing. After a grueling 3-week trial that had captured national attention, justice was finally within reach. Sarah sat in the front row, her now recovering mother beside her, as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict that would redefine corporate accountability in America. The evidence presented during the trial had been overwhelming. Years of falsified safety reports, diverted funds, and deliberately buried complaints painted a picture of systematic corruption that had prioritized profit over human lives. The security footage showing Sterling and Wells' direct involvement in covering up John Miller's death proved particularly damning. The judge's voice rang clear through the packed courtroom. "In all my years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated disregard for human life in pursuit of profit." Sterling and Wells were sentenced to 20 years each for criminal negligence, resulting in death, fraud, and conspiracy. The sentence included mandatory restitution to all affected families. Beyond the criminal penalties, the judge ordered a complete restructuring of Thompson Construction's safety protocols. An independent oversight board would be established, with worker representatives holding majority voting power on safety decisions. The company would be required to fund annual safety audits and provide comprehensive healthcare coverage for all workers and their families. Richard's testimony had been crucial to the prosecution's case. His detailed documentation of the corruption, combined with his own acknowledgement of past negligence, provided a powerful narrative of corporate responsibility and redemption. The judge specifically cited his transformation from negligent CEO to whistleblower as evidence that corporate culture could be reformed. The verdict sparked immediate changes across the construction industry. Other companies, fearing similar scrutiny, began proactively reviewing their safety protocols. Worker advocacy groups gained unprecedented access to corporate boardrooms, their demands for safety reforms now backed by the threat of criminal prosecution for negligent executives. Thompson Construction underwent a complete transformation. Richard, cleared of wrongdoing, declined to return as CEO, instead accepting a position on the newly formed Worker Safety Board. His first action was to establish the John Miller Memorial Fund, providing education and support for families affected by workplace accidents. Sarah's role in exposing the corruption received special recognition. The judge praised her courage in working with Richard despite their painful history, noting how their unlikely alliance had helped bring about systemic change. Her testimony about the human cost of corporate negligence, her father's death, her mother's illness, her own interrupted childhood became required reading in business ethics courses. The media coverage shifted from sensationalism to substance, examining how corporate corruption affected real families. Interviews with workers' families, including Mary Miller, highlighted the long-term impact of unsafe working conditions on communities. The story became a catalyst for national discussions about corporate responsibility and worker protection. Financial restitution began flowing to affected families. Mary's medical treatments were fully covered, allowing her access to experimental therapies that had previously been out of reach. The Miller family home was saved from foreclosure, and a trust was established to fund Sarah's medical education. Sterling and Wells' network of corruption crumbled in the wake of their conviction. Building inspectors faced criminal charges, corrupt officials were removed from office, and companies that had enabled their scheme faced hefty fines and increased scrutiny. The message was clear: corporate corruption would no longer be treated as merely a cost of doing business. The courtroom victory represented more than just punishment for past crimes. It established new precedents for corporate accountability. Executives could no longer hide behind ignorance or delegation of responsibility. The judge's ruling made it clear that leadership came with an obligation to ensure worker safety, backed by the force of criminal law. As Sarah and Mary left the courthouse, they were met by a group of construction workers wearing black armbands in memory of John Miller. The workers' children held signs reading "Thank you, Sarah" and "Justice for all workers." The sight of families standing together, demanding accountability and celebrating justice, proved that John Miller's death had sparked a movement for lasting change. The spring following Sterling and Wells' conviction brought more than just justice. It ushered in a season of healing for both the Miller and Thompson families. Mary's health improved dramatically with access to advanced treatments, her recovery mirroring the renewal happening around them. Sarah celebrated her 18th birthday in her mother's hospital room, but this time the atmosphere was different. Richard had arranged for specialists from across the country to consult on Mary's case, and their innovative treatment protocol was showing promising results. The room was filled with flowers, cards from supporters, and something that had been missing for years: hope. Emma Thompson, witnessing her father's redemption through media coverage, reached out to reconnect. Their first meeting was awkward but healing, as Richard shared the full story of how a little girl's kindness had helped him find his way back to his own humanity. Emma began spending weekends in Chicago, slowly rebuilding her relationship with her father, while forming an unexpected friendship with Sarah. But Mary's perspective proved crucial to the healing process. During her recovery, she shared stories about John that helped both Sarah and Richard understand him better, not just as a victim of corporate greed, but as a man who had fought for worker safety out of genuine concern for others. These stories helped Richard see how his past actions and inactions had affected real families. The healing extended beyond their immediate families. Richard and Sarah established a support group for families affected by workplace accidents, creating a community where people could share their experiences and help each other recover. The group became a powerful voice for worker safety, turning personal pain into collective action for change. Elizabeth Thompson, Richard's ex-wife, made her own journey toward understanding. After seeing the full extent of Sterling and Wells' manipulation, she began to question her hasty judgment of Richard. While their marriage couldn't be salvaged, they found a new way to co-parent Emma, united by their shared understanding of how corruption had torn their family apart. The Gold Star, which had started their journey, found a permanent home in a display case at Thompson Construction's headquarters. Alongside it were photos of John Miller and other workers who had lost their lives, serving as a constant reminder of the human cost of corporate negligence and the power of compassion to drive change. Sarah's healing came in unexpected ways. Working with Richard to establish safety protocols at Thompson Construction helped her feel connected to her father's legacy. She discovered that helping other families fight for justice gave purpose to her own pain, transforming grief into action. The Miller home, nearly lost to medical bills and legal fees, was saved and renovated through a worker-led initiative. Construction workers volunteered their weekends, turning the apartment into a comfortable home where Mary could continue her recovery. Each repair felt like a step toward healing, a community's way of saying they remembered John Miller's sacrifice. Richard found his own path to healing through service. He dedicated himself to mentoring young executives about corporate responsibility, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the cost of negligence and the importance of active oversight. His experiences became a case study in business schools, teaching future leaders about the human side of corporate decisions. Family dinners became a new tradition, with the Millers and Thompsons sharing meals and memories. Emma would help Sarah study for her medical school entrance exams, while Mary and Richard swapped stories about John's determination to make workplaces safer. These gatherings helped heal old wounds while creating new bonds. The most profound healing came in quiet moments. Sarah watching her mother regain strength during physical therapy sessions. Richard and Emma walking through Chicago parks, rebuilding their father-daughter bond. Mary tending to the small garden that workers had built outside her window, finding joy in nurturing new life. Through it all, they learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing how to carry it forward. The pain of loss and betrayal would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined their future. Instead, they found strength in their shared commitment to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. On the 6th anniversary of John Miller's death, Sarah and Richard announced the creation of the Miller-Thompson Foundation for Worker Safety and Family Support. The foundation's headquarters, established in a renovated building near the site of John's accident, symbolized the transformation of tragedy into hope. The foundation's mission extended beyond traditional worker safety advocacy. Its first initiative was the John Miller Scholarship Program, providing full college funding for children of workplace accident victims. Sarah insisted that the scholarships cover not just tuition but living expenses, remembering her own struggles to balance education with family responsibilities. Mary's successful recovery inspired the creation of the Foundation's Family Health Initiative. This program provided comprehensive healthcare coverage for families affected by workplace accidents, ensuring that no other family would have to choose between medical treatment and basic necessities. The program became a model for corporate healthcare reform nationwide. Richard contributed his business expertise to develop the Foundation's corporate accountability program, This initiative worked with companies to implement robust safety protocols, providing training and resources while maintaining strict oversight. Companies that met the foundation's standards received certification that became highly valued in the construction industry. Emma brought her legal background to the foundation, establishing a legal aid division that provided free representation to workers and families dealing with unsafe working conditions. The program paired experienced attorneys with families who couldn't afford legal protection, ensuring that no worker's voice went unheard. The Foundation's most innovative program was the Safety First Technology Initiative, which developed and distributed advanced safety equipment to construction sites across the country. Each piece of equipment carried a small plaque with John Miller's name, ensuring that his legacy of protecting fellow workers lived on. Worker education became a cornerstone of the Foundation's mission. Regular workshops and training sessions helped workers understand their rights and recognize unsafe conditions. The program included leadership training for workers who wanted to become safety advocates within their companies. The Foundation's annual Worker Safety Conference became a major industry event, bringing together corporate leaders, safety experts, and worker representatives. The highlight was the John Miller Courage Award, presented to individuals who demonstrated exceptional commitment to worker safety, often at personal risk. Sarah's medical training influenced the Foundation's approach to health monitoring. Regular health screenings were provided for workers and their families, catching potential issues early and ensuring proper treatment. The program's success led to industry-wide adoption of preventive health measures. The Foundation's research division, headed by leading safety experts, continuously studied ways to improve workplace conditions. Their findings were freely shared with the industry, making safety innovations accessible to companies of all sizes. The research led to several breakthrough developments in protective equipment and safety protocols. Community outreach remained central to the Foundation's work. Regular events brought together workers' families, creating support networks that helped people cope with loss and celebrate recovery. But these gatherings helped heal old wounds while forging new bonds between families who understood each other's struggles. The Miller-Thompson Foundation became more than just an organization. It became a symbol of how tragedy could be transformed into positive change. Its success proved that corporate responsibility and worker safety could coexist with profitability, setting new standards for the entire industry. As Sarah watched the Foundation grow, she often thought about the path that had led here from a little girl, giving away her last loaf of bread to a leader in worker safety advocacy. The gold star that had started their journey now sat in the Foundation's lobby, reminding visitors that the smallest act of kindness could spark monumental change. Richard, now serving as the Foundation's senior advisor, found peace in seeing how their shared pain had been transformed into a force for good. The Foundation's work ensured that John Miller's death, while tragic, had sparked changes that would protect countless other families from similar loss. Thank you for joining us for this emotional story of redemption, justice, and healing. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings about Sarah and Richard's journey. What touched you the most? How did their story impact you? Please share your experiences in the comments below. If you appreciate stories that explore the depths of human compassion and resilience, consider subscribing to our channel. Your support enables us to continue creating meaningful content that touches hearts and inspires change. Don't forget to like this video and share it with friends and family who might find hope and inspiration in this story of forgiveness and redemption. Together, we can spread messages of healing and positive change. Join our community of storytellers and listeners. Your engagement helps us bring more powerful stories to light,